Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be reading true Appalachian Trail / Appalachian Mountain horror stories. I hope you enjoy them. So, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. Back in 2021, my family took a trip to Lake Sanitla in North Carolina, a beautiful lake that's rich in Native American history and surrounded by mountain trails. We decided to go on one of these trails on an overcast day. I'm not an athletic person and suffer from asthma, so I was behind the rest of my family by myself. About almost halfway through the hike, I hear my sister yell my birth name, but it sounded like it was off the trail. She never calls me by my real name, just my nickname that I've had since I was a baby. It sounded like she was scared, so I was very tempted to run off and find her, but I knew my sister wasn't stupid. She wouldn't go off the trail even in case of an emergency. I quickly caught up to the rest of my family, and my sister was there with them, resting on some rocks next to a waterfall, chatting away and taking pictures. I asked my sister if she had called my name. She didn't know what I was talking about. She had been talking to our dad the whole time. I don't know what called my name that day, but I'm glad I didn't listen to it. Who knows what would have happened to me? I haven't been on that trail since this encounter. I don't have a clue what called my name. But if you're educated on Appalachian folklore, please give me some insight on what happened to me. I am from a semi-rural town out in the Ohio side of the Appalachian foothills. We have a lot of folklore in the area, but I actually experienced something spooky back in autumn of 2020. My family loves going on drives, and I especially love the quietness of night drives. I was home visiting, and we went on a midnight drive, with my brother and cousin tagging along. Since it was the start of autumn, I suggested we drive out to one of the old cemeteries near where my mom used to live. It's settled on a hill, bordered by hundreds of acres of woods and farms, spotty cell reception if any, and listed as a non-GPS route. While all of this sounds sketchy, the area is really beautiful, and my family hunts out there, never having encountered any issues. Folks are nice, and it's far enough from town that you don't deal with many of the problems there, like the drugs, crime, etc. It was about 2 a.m., and this was going to be the last stop before heading back to my brother's place to sleep. The route I would normally take was blocked due to the bridge work, and forced us to take a literal dirt road through the woods. I've taken that road one other time, so the bridge closure didn't deter me from getting to the cemetery. We arrived at the cemetery, and I was stopped at one of the forks deciding where to park, so we could get out and walk around. Windows were down since I was smoking when I heard a whistle. Not a bird whistle, but a person whistle, like if you were trying to get someone's attention. This confused me since it's the middle of the night, middle of nowhere, and very close by. My brother asks if I heard that, confirming to myself that my ears did not deceive me. And as I pause to listen for anything else, the silence is broken by my brother panicking. He points to one of the taller headstones about 20 to 30 feet away from the car, yelling, "What is that?" The only way I can describe this is we saw what looked like a very large person bear crawling and darting between tombstones towards my car. It was very humanoid in figure, but looked hairy and lanky. There are moments in life where your lizard brain kicks in, like, hey, you're in danger, please run. And this was one of those times. I whipped out of the cemetery so fast I was worried I was going to pop a tire or spin out. We made it back to his place safely, hardly slept, and recounted our experience to each other in the morning, confirming that we all did in fact hear and see that. I have been back to that cemetery since, with our hunting dog, but have not experienced anything like that again, thankfully. Growing up in the Appalachian Mountains, I could give you a million times as a kid and young adult that I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost, not literally, out there by myself or with friends. As kids, we never got too far out there, but you could actually see the progression of us venturing further and further out as we got older, because of forts and carvings that we would leave. This one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We had decided to try and find a new place to set up camp, and walked for what felt like a few miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us. We got the camp set up and fire going, and the plan was to wait until nightfall, smoke some weed, and play Monopoly. For sake of backstory on my friend and I, my buddy is a smaller, real goofy guy, but comes from a family of foresters, and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants you came across. He had no fear of going and camping out by himself. If I spent 10,000 hours in the woods, he probably spent 50,000. As for me, I'm a taller, sturdier guy, and as we got older, I spent more time worried about women and sports, and the woods became a place for small parties. Also, I never had the balls to camp out alone. In fact, older me wouldn't go far at all when I was alone, because I could never shake the feeling of being watched, which was just paranoia, but still an uneasy feeling. Anyways, camp is set, fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs wood. Sun is down and we're both cutting up and having a good time. My friend is sitting on this little chair that he always brought, and loading up this makeshift bong, and I was crouched breaking some excess limbs off of some logs we had gathered for the fire. All of a sudden, this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I both stopped immediately and looked at each other. The breeze went just long enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness, and neither of us said a word. Across from us on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running and would slow to a walk and then run again, definitely on two legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped, with a softer crunch on the underbrush. I knew by the sound it had taken a crouch. I was crouched still and knew I was staring at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy," and when he did, I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel it and hear it in him too. I had been so fixed on the footsteps and rationalizing what I heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid. But this was true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend after a while grab some leaves, and he dropped them on the fire. For the split second the leaves covered the fire, we were in pure darkness. Then the fire sprang to life. We both quickly grabbed more leaves and brush and threw it on the fire. I got some sticks and logs on there, and neither of us took our eyes off of the spot, or moved much for over an hour. Finally, the leaves crunched, and it slowly walked off. Whatever it was had sat crouched, watching us without moving for far longer than any animal would. It wasn't until after the footsteps disappeared that I realized the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill. Spoiled eggs almost. For the rest of the night, besides whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped looking at that spot. Nobody went into the tent, and I had a very short, light sleep sitting on the ground with my head rested on my hands. My friend never went to sleep. In the morning, we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day, we talk about it. In the 7 to 8 years since it happened, my forester friend has not camped by himself out there since.
I have always been an avid mountain person. When people say they go to the beach for vacation, I respect it, but I prefer the mountains 100%. Something about these old giants has always fascinated me, as if I just cannot avoid but to be drawn towards them and be in awe when hiking on them. Over my short life, 21-year-old student, I consider that I have seen a fair amount of mountain ranges in Europe, from the Alps in Switzerland to the Pyrenees in Spain, and from the Italian Dolomites to the Czech Stolov Mountains. I have always hiked and camped outdoors a lot, with family and friends, but also by myself. Now I went to the United States for college, and I have always been tempted to do a part of the Appalachian Trail. From the pictures I saw on the internet, I always wanted to see them in person, and not going to lie, I must say that the great amount of scary stories of these mountains always attracted me a little bit as well. I am definitely not a person who likes scary movies or anything, but I enjoy reading fellow mountaineer experiences, and to be honest, I mostly just read stories about the AT to know how to prep myself for when I was going to do it. The scary stories just got my attention every now and a while. That being said, I decided to go to this year and do a small part of the AT. I went to do a small part between the borders of Tennessee and North Carolina, with Clingman's Dome being the icing on the cake. I was a little bit hesitant to go by myself, since I am not very familiar with both the geography, as well as the wildlife in this part of the States. I wanted to go with a friend or my girlfriend, who is from North Carolina herself, but both my friend from Germany. As my girlfriend declined because they had to work, I had spring break. So I decided I just had to go by myself since I am graduating this year and will return back to Europe. I started at this place called Bryson City and walked along the Tuckasegee River until I reached the Nolan Creek trailhead. From there on, I just followed the trail until I would reach Clingman's Dome, and from Clingman's Dome I would follow the AT for about a week. I had prepared well for this trip. I carried bear spray and pepper spray. I read some freaky stories about people in the AT, and I also brought this hunting knife and axe for wood. I had some canned food and lots of water, plus water filter, and for the rest, just my tent and sleeping bag. So when I started walking away from Bryson City, and I saw the beautiful aura this mountain range had, I couldn't be happier. I had been wanting to do this since I had arrived here in the US, and I was finally doing it. I encountered some people on the Nolan Creek trailhead who were friendly, but I had made up my mind that I would be better off alone than with strangers. I reached Clingman's Dome the same day and went a little further before I would set camp. It was beautiful. At night, I slept a bit off the trail with a small campfire while I had dinner, in which I put out before I went to sleep. The first night went super well, as I also was exhausted from the hike to Clingman's Dome. The next 2 days were just as beautiful, and I saw lots of breathtaking views. The people on the AT I encountered were super polite as well. Then, at the third night, I feel like everything took a strange turn. I had set up my camp just as usual, around 160 feet from the trail. No one was camping close to me, or at least not that I was aware of. While getting dinner, I just had this super weird gut feeling that I was not alone there. I felt like as if someone was looking at me from behind a tree or something like that. I tried to just convince myself that I was having an amazing time, that I was safe, and that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I went to sleep and put out the fire as usual. Then, before it was daylight again, I woke up. I woke up with this same gut feeling that, even though I was in my tent, someone was watching my tent from a distance. I did not hear a single bird, which was weird, because right before daylight is when they start chirping again. I only heard the wind and the leaves. It made me feel uncomfortable. a bit scared even. I didn't fall asleep again, and first thing in the morning, after having breakfast in my tent, I broke up camp and decided to continue my hike. During my hike, I encountered a few people, and again, they were very nice, but I stick to myself. While walking on this part of the trail by myself alone, I felt being observed again. I even had the feeling as if something or someone was following me, so every now and then I would stop dead in my tracks in order to hear if it was real. Now, obviously my mind could be playing tricks, but I would swear that I heard the steps stop a second after I had stopped. So according to me at that moment, someone was following me. I looked around me the whole time and I never saw someone or something, which made it even more weird. After the long day of hiking, I made camp, this time closer to the trail than usual, because for some reason I thought it would be more safe. I again had this gut feeling of being watched while having dinner outside my tent. So I decided to finish it up in my tent, and I went to the bathroom in a bottle, because I did not want to go outside now. I tried to sleep by closing my eyes, but my mind just focused on hearing the whole time. And that is when I heard it for the first time. A knock, as if a branch was hitting a tree, or a small rock was getting thrown at a tree. Silence followed, for what seemed an eternity but probably only 10 minutes. Then again, this time more clear. I was scared now and had no idea where to go since it was dark already. I put on my flashlight in the tent and made myself as big as I could, so that my shadow outside the tent would look bigger because of the light. I don't know why this was my reasoning at the time. I just thought of bears, and I held my hunting knife in my hand. The silence had followed the second knock, but now I shouted to pierce the silence in the dark. First, I shouted that whoever was joking around, I was armed, and I was not wanting to be pranked. I thought this would scare them off. It didn't. I heard another knock, and immediately after a knock, on what I assumed to be the opposite side from my tent. So now I was guessing it was two people instead of one, and that they liked to pull a prank on an innocent passerby. I tried to stay up as long as I could, but around 4 a.m. my eyes just gave up, and I dwelled off. I woke up around 8 a.m. again, with the light of the sun being my savior. I first tried to hear if whoever was pranking me was still knocking. I did not hear anything. I shouted again, stating that I was now going to exit my tent with my knife in my hand, and that whoever had been joking around should make themselves known. I walked out of my tent and I did not see anyone. I looked for tracks around my camp but could not immediately make something out of it. I decided to get out of there. The next part of my week basically continued being the same. At night, I'd hear some knocks from different directions, and occasionally I heard what I would guess was a little bit of humming, like as if a person was just humming a tune. Now I never saw anyone except from the occasional hikers on the AT, so I cannot say I saw something weird, but I never shook of this weird gut feeling of being observed and followed during the rest of my hike on the AT. I am now back and commented this to my girlfriend. She says it was probably my mind playing tricks on me, and I am willing to believe her because I never saw anything. But I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I am in that tent in the middle of nowhere, and someone is watching me and knocking on a tree. And every time I wake up like this, the thought alone scares me.
I wasn't sure where to post this, but I needed the validation that I'm not insane. I've never really had paranormal experiences, but I cannot explain this. I'm in college, and me and some other 7 people from my school went on a backpacking trip, and we had 2 experienced leaders. We drove to Zaleski State Forest, which is in the Appalachian region of Ohio. It was early April this year, and it was cold, and everything was still dead from winter. After hiking miles into the forest, we set up camp at the backpacking campsite, and there were a couple of other groups of people as well. A few of them were friendly older couples and then 2 college-aged girls. Everyone was pretty spread out from each other. We set up camp further away from everyone else. I've always been able to sense energies of places, and the energy in this area wasn't great. It was almost spooky. Each of us had individual one-person tents, and we formed kind of a cluster in this site, with my tent being in the back so no one was behind me. Our cluster was also right next to the forest, because this backpacking site was like a big cleared-off square in the middle of the trees. Fast forward, I'm dead asleep at around 2 a.m., and I wake up to leaves crunching right behind my tent. I hear footsteps walking in circles around my tent. They had a sort of heaviness to them that couldn't be a deer or a dog. Also, it sounded like just two legs. I cannot make this up. This creature was circling my tent for long periods of time, slowly creeping up to the sides of my tent and then just stopping for periods of time, and then would move on walking around the rest of our tent cluster. I could hear a human-like breathing from the mouth when it was close to my tent, like a light sort of heaving. I was shaking, too scared to unzip my tent and investigate. I kid you not, this occurred for hours, and it seemed like I was the only one awake. Out of nowhere, I see an illuminated light shape from my tent, although I couldn't tell what it was from inside my tent because it was all zipped up. It was like a warm glow and it didn't move, like a flashlight would. I was paralyzed in fear. I simply couldn't believe it was an animal. At some point I fell asleep due to sheer exhaustion, but I could hear the heavy footsteps circling until I did. In the morning, I questioned my fellow campers about it, and my leader admitted she heard the footsteps and noises as well, admitting it was bizarre, and she would have investigated had she not been so groggy. One of the boys in the group said that he also noticed the light that came on, but thought that it was someone else. Not a single person in this group went up to go to the bathroom or turned on a light that night. I've heard things about the Appalachian regions being creepy and bizarre, and now I believe it. Some people on Reddit have leaned towards Bigfoot, because apparently he's associated with light orbs. Never been a Bigfoot believer, but I'm telling you, this didn't feel like just any animal, like a bear. My girlfriend and I went camping out in the backwoods of Greenbrier County, West Virginia. We were both 18 years old and drove about 5 hours to get to the camping spot to stay Friday to Sunday. Friday afternoon, we arrive and make camp. I put up the tent and we take a short hike, and then I built a fire and we settled in for the night. No issues so far. Saturday morning, we wake up and get ready for a day of adventuring. We were busy walking miles and miles, and we ran into two different sets of people who were also camping fairly close to where we were. Eventually, the sun surrenders to darkness, and out in this area, nighttime is super dark. We have lanterns and flashlights, but no major issues except for a few mosquitoes. Shortly after, around 1 a.m., we turned in for the night, zipped up the tent, and we were both out pretty quick after a full day of activity. I'm a very light sleeper, and it didn't feel like very long after I fell asleep that I heard a soft rustling sound. Whatever was making the noise, it sounded like it was about 20 yards away from the tent. I looked over at my girlfriend. Sound asleep. Why can't I sleep like that? I figured that the soft rustling sound was a small animal or something else minor, and tried to go back to sleep. Then, the soft rustling sound stopped. Then suddenly, in the silence of the night, I heard a loud thud that sounded like a decent-sized piece of wood falling onto the forest floor from a couple of feet high, coming from the same direction the soft rustling sound came from. Again, my girlfriend didn't hear anything and was still asleep. I had to pee anyway, so I began to unzip the tent, and my girlfriend slightly woke up and rolled over asking, "Where are you going?" Not wanting to worry her, I told her I just had to pee, then grabbed a flashlight and crawled out of the tent, immediately shining the light in the direction the sound was coming from. There was nothing, just trees, bushes, and total darkness that seemed as if it was swallowing up the beam of my flashlight. I walked around the edge of the campsite looking for anything out of the ordinary, but just as I was about to give up, the flashlight beam caught two reflections out in the dark. They were eyes, and they were looking back at me. I stood there with the flashlight beam locked on the eyes. They appeared low to the ground and didn't seem to be moving, but after a few seconds, the 2 points of light moved to reveal it was nothing but a bunny. I laughed at myself, answered nature's call, and returned to the tent laughing at myself. I settled back into my sleeping bag trying to fall asleep, and I was almost there when out of nowhere I heard a very loud noise that seemed to be coming from only a few feet from the tent. It sounded like a heavy animal's footstep, like the footsteps of the T-Rex from Jurassic Park. I sat up, waiting to hear more sounds, while images of what could possibly be making these sounds in the middle of the night flashed through my head. I remained awake for another hour and a half or so, until I finally fell asleep for the night. In the morning, some of those nearby campers we had met the day before walked up to our campsite asking if we had heard or seen anything the night before. My girlfriend began to reply, "No, we didn't," before I interrupted her and said that I had heard some strange noises. The other campers ran into a wildlife officer who had told them to be on alert because a bear had been spotted in the vicinity.
Southeast Kentucky. It's where the bulk of my family lives, except I have a cousin who grew up elsewhere with my uncle who has money and lives a bit better than most of his kin. My cousin is an artsy guy who was brought up with stories from his dad about the area, and it gave him a very romanticized idea of mountain life. He used to visit a lot as a kid, so he associated the mountains with family and fun, and not the crazies I grew up with some 20 years later. Well, he comes in to visit and has this idea that he's going to go visit and photograph this place called Rebel Rock. His dad has talked it up some, and so it had to be important, right? He just kind of gathered me and my aunt and his wife up and said he knew where to find it, and we were off. I was maybe 16 or 17 at the time, and I realized as we were driving that my aunt was getting noticeably uncomfortable, and I couldn't understand why. It took me a bit to realize that after we'd got back on this back road on the way to Rebel Rock, we were driving past sign after sign that said no trespassing. At some point I brought it up, and my cousin just waves it off as no big deal. Rebel Rock is a landmark, right? His dad visited it, so it must be open to the public. We finally get to this rock, which is right on the side of the road, and it's trashed. My cousin decides to walk further into the woods and leave the rest of us standing outside the car while he's trying to find an angle not covered in beer bottles and graffiti. While we're standing there, I realize that there's words spray painted on the asphalt right in front of where he parked. "We can see you," so I freak out, and my aunt comes over and looks at it and laughs. This is how horror movies start. And that's when we see a glint of light across from us. The way we were parked where Rebel Rock is, we were near the edge of the mountain and directly across from another cliff. And if you squinted, you could see light shining off glass across from us. It's a fucking scope. They were using it like binoculars. We also see movement, meaning somebody is over there. Suddenly, everyone is yelling at my cousin that we need to go. Now. He has the keys. He dragged us up there. We are there basically as his prisoners. We are trespassing, and somebody saw us. And trespassing in the mountains is not a good idea. You may get some irritated old lady. You could get somebody cooking meth. You're equally likely to get shot. This was a bad idea all around. Of course he's not listening. He says we're being paranoid. Or, at the very least, just one more shot and we can go. At this point, we hear a truck coming down the road from further up the mountain, and every last one of us is hoping we found a reasonable bunch. And then comes this pickup, full of folks. They're in the cab, in the bed. It's like they formed a posse just to get us. They start grilling my aunt about what we're doing, and before we can answer, here comes my cousin. They seem even more baffled when they see this city boy with his fancy camera. and my cousin flawlessly integrates himself in to speak. Thankfully, they were nice enough people. Once they realized my cousin was there just to take photos, they dropped the anger and just were picking on him about not listening to the no trespassing signs. Turns out they just monitor Rebel Rock pretty intently because teenagers and younger folks like to come out there and party, drink, do drugs, and trash the place, which is super frustrating for them. Not to mention pricey when they have to have the garbage hauled away. They were baffled when they got to us, and it was one teen, some middle-aged women, and some dude with a camera. They let us off the hook, and my cousin got his pictures, so it ended well in the end. But just the realization you're being watched in the middle of the woods, and just hearing that noisy-ass truck slowly making its way to us was absolutely horrifying.
I was traveling down south and stopped in a little town that anyone from the north going to the south knows, right on the West Virginia, North Carolina state lines. I was staying at a Ramada there, just outside of the town. It's the typical strip of hotels, motels, and a truck stop right off the freeway. I decided to go stretch my legs and walked behind the motel where there was a big field with the freeway just beyond. The sun had just set, so the sky still had that light that makes light-colored things glow a little. I don't know why I went back there, especially alone, but as I was standing there, I started feeling uneasy. Then I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye in the field. I looked hard and could barely make out something white. I knew there were a lot of feral cats and kittens around, and thought it might be that. Just as I started to realize this was just a bad idea, the little white thing became big and was moving at speed in my direction. I sprinted down the parking lot and towards the office without slowing to look behind me. I knew whatever it was still coming by the looks on the faces of the people unloading their cars for the night as I was running past. Suddenly I heard a scrape, a scream, and a splat. When I turned around, there was a scrawny woman splayed out on the sidewalk, matted hair with dried and fresh blood on her face. She was screeching like a banshee. Someone had tripped her, not knowing what was going on. Long story short, she was in the field after getting dirty with a truck driver in exchange for meth. He punched her a few times and she stabbed him. Minor injury because he went back to his rig and drove away, but later turned up at a hospital in North Carolina. I switched to a different hotel for the night, and when I returned home, I took a concealed carry class and got a license, and a little buddy which now goes where I go. Especially when I'm standing behind sketchy Appalachian hotels, near truck stops, in the dark.
When I was living in rural Appalachia a handful of years ago, I had someone, or multiple people, repeatedly harass me at night for over a year. I never found out who it was, but it might have been either an old friend of my grandfather's who was growing weed near my house, or possibly one of the people from down the mountain who used to dirt bike through the forest in the evening. At the time, I would walk through the neighborhood, which is less a proper neighborhood and more along the lines of 20 houses spread over a half-mile patch of dirt road, and surrounding forest if I couldn't sleep. One night during my usual rounds, I began feeling as though something was watching me. I had seen wild animals during my walks before, including a bear which, side note, was horrifying. So I decided to trust my instincts and get back to my house as calmly but quickly as possible. The eerie feeling of being stalked followed me all the way to my house. I admittedly was a bit too afraid to really listen for the footsteps of whatever was following me. I was 19-20, so the logic of if I don't hear it, it isn't real totally made sense to me. I got back to my house safely and went to bed that night sure that were I to search the woods the following morning, I wasn't going to find any trace of what had been tracking me. Unfortunately, I was wrong. When I searched the woods the next day, I found a used condom right at the tree line beside my house. After that incident, I began hearing knocking on the wall nearest the tree line, tapping on the windows, and the sounds of people speaking. I did convince my mother to go check it out a few times, but whoever it was would already be loudly running back through the forest by the time she got around the house. Things got so bad that I was eventually, after months of dealing with these nightly occurrences, and my grandparents refusing to let me do anything about it, able to convince my uncle, who lived nearby, to put up a security camera. Unfortunately, it was the kind that only displayed a live feed, and he had it facing my front door instead of the woods. If you're wondering, I absolutely thought this entire setup was sketchy. He also insisted on monitoring from his house, and he insisted that he never saw anyone on camera. It was around this time that someone also sliced through the fabric cover on my grill and stole a storage crate full of my old clothing from inside a shed. Once the batteries in the camera died, my uncle declared that I had been imagining things, despite the damaged property and missing clothing, and insisted on removing the camera from my property. Not even a week later, I was walking to my grandparents' house, which is a little more than 100 feet up the hill from my own house, because I had forgotten to lock their door, and they rarely did so themselves. I was in their driveway when I saw something duck behind their porch. I rushed back down to my house, and I asked my mother to lock their door instead, because I thought I had seen something. I didn't want to say that I had seen a person, because by this point my uncle and grandparents had me half convinced that my mother and I really were just imagining things. But no, long story short, she had to chase a man in light-colored clothing off their property. She unfortunately didn't get a look at the man's face. On the bright side, he ran into a tree. That last incident happened in November, and my grandfather's friend died that December. The strange occurrences pretty much halted after that point, though the following year I heard a cell phone ring outside my window. Someone broke into my uncle's truck and rummaged around, and my elderly neighbor had someone pacing her driveway during a power outage. Being from the city, and before that a railway town, I'm not exactly a stranger to creepy things happening at night or attempted break-ins, but there's something uniquely sinister when these things start happening in the middle of nowhere. In May of 2003, I was fresh out of high school and had just joined the Marines. There was a period from when I joined until I could go to boot. So I took those few weeks to sign up for a survival camp. A local company in Gatlinburg offered survival techniques over a 10-day period. We met at the Elkmont campground in the Great Smoky Mountains with a group of 5 other survivalists and a group leader and his assistant. They would stay with us for 3 days and show us techniques. Things like setting up tents, identifying local flora and fauna that was edible, how to set traps, etc. Each of us were given a backpack with items that you may commonly carry when hiking: chapstick, binoculars, some protein bars, lighter matches, and we were allowed one personal item. I brought a small hatchet as I knew what items was included in the backpack from the start. In case you didn't know, you can walk down the Elkmont Trail, and you run into an abandoned town. It's an eerie place, as it was a dreary day. The town was all but abandoned in 1992, when the leases expired and people living there left. There were a few people living there, until 2001, when the last person left for good. All the places are kept up by the NPS, and they are all well preserved from the logging town it once was. So with approval by the NPS to use one of the buildings as base for the first few days, we started our training. For 3 days, our group did several things. We used the Little Pigeon River to get water, which we liked boil for 15 minutes to kill anything in the water. There are a few natural springs in the area that you can drink fresh, and the guides showed us these. We learned how to make lean-to, how to use rock walls to make shelter with fire, heating it up to keep warm, how to build hammocks out of kudzu vines, what wild strawberries look like, along with several other things. They did not show us mushrooms, as these are easily misidentified, so they don't chance that for legal reason. But the puffball ones are the only ones they allowed us to pick, as they are easily identifiable. We also made traps like snares and rock falls, along with making fishing line out of kudzu vines and makeshift hooks, or finding fish in quiet zones of the creek where you could trap trout. We learned how to make fire with binocular glass, matches and lighter, and proper teepee builds for you kindling. After the 3 days, we were let go on our own. You would stay at base camp, and the leader would walk you several miles into the undergrowth. Each of us were taken at different times, and given a satellite radio in case we had an emergency. So we set off on our own and made the best of it. The group leaders would stay at base and wait 5 days, then come get you. Day 1, nothing out of the ordinary. I set a few traps, built a decent lean-to on the side of a large boulder. Fire is doing a solid job of heating the rock wall to keep it pretty warm inside. The air was crisp, not quite cold. Some drizzle, but no deluges. I'm close enough to the river that I only need to walk 70 yards or so. I'm not quite up the mountains, but on somewhat of a hill, surrounded by pawpaw, rhododendrons that are starting to bloom, catalpa, and several conifers. I eat half of a protein bar and collected quite a few plants. First night is quiet. Only hear a few things out in the forest. It's very dark outside the firelight. I've collected enough wood to keep any critters at bay, namely black bears, as they can be curious. I was awoken at some point in the night by the sat phone. Another survivalist is complaining about some large animal walking around his campground. Seems to believe it's a bear, but it sounds like it's walking on 2 legs. Never says anything else the rest of the night. Night goes by without incident. I will say I did find tracks that looked human but were indicative of a Bigfoot, as the footprint wasn't formed quite like ours. I wear a size 12 boot. This I put my foot into the print, and it was a solid 5 inches longer. Now there are stories of the TN Wildman in this part of the country, and several of the stories originated in Coke County, which is just to the north of Sevier and Jefferson, on the other side of the GSM. My grandfather owns a small cabin in Newport, and has told me stories about him hunting and something following him. I brushed the stories off until I saw that print, and from night 1 sat call. Night 3 is where everything went to crap. Around 1 a.m. is when I started question things when a large rock hit the back of my lean-to. I figured it was from the boulder, and something simply broke off, as rock slides are common around here. After that woke me up, I grabbed the flashlight and assessed the damage. I rolled the boulder off the shelter, and it wasn't too far from breaking it completely. I partly fixed it and figured I'd just fix it in the morning. I had caught a rabbit in a snare, and I cleaned it not far from camp. I'd say 100 yards off. I could hear noises from that area, but chalked it up to raccoons or a fox. I shined the light that way but saw nothing as the trees were too thick. Then something screamed. It sounded like a gorilla when it gets angry, followed by a chuffing sound, like when a dog has drank too much water. That deep in the throat, like it's clearing it out. I stood there frozen in this tiny clearing, thinking a bear is finishing off the entrails of the rabbit I cleaned earlier. I have no weapons other than my hatchet and a pocket knife. I come out of my trance and walk over to my backpack, never taking my eyes off the woodline. Everything in the night is quiet. I only hear the river running and the logs crackling. I sit down with my hatchet and throw more logs on the fire, hoping that it gets large and hit enough to keep thing at bay. I sit for maybe 30 minutes and I'm kind of dozing off. Then another rock comes hurling from the left side of the forest and falls 10 yards away. I know the boulder didn't do this based on where this rock came from. Now I'm panicking. I stand up, hoping to make myself look large with my shadow on the boulder behind me. I hear the chuffing again, and smaller trees further in are clearly moving back and forth rather quickly. I can see a large black shape moving around the firelight, just at the edge of the end of the light. 40 yards in, maybe. I can hear this thing breaking limbs, crushing leaves with every step. Thing was at least 8 feet tall if I had to guess, but it was pretty far away from where I was. It's slowly moving away, but I could tell where the thing's head was watching me, as every now and again I'd see eye shine. The sounds started getting fainter and fainter, and I could hear it go into the river and cross it. That loud shush shush sound from the water as it crossed were only a few steps. It was about 20 feet across the river at this point. I sat back down and contemplated what to do. It's around 2 a.m. and I have a few hours till daylight. I don't want to walk the 4 miles back to Elkmont in the dark, in a place I'm not familiar with. Fast forward 2 hours. It's 4-ish a.m. The sat phone turns on, and a guy is screaming into it. Something is trying to kill me. I've had several ricks thrown at me. A large man is outside my shelter. I can hear it. This isn't a bear. I don't know what it is, but I need help. Silence. Another guy comes on. Something did that to me last night, but I thought it was a bear. I stayed here thinking I knew what it was. Rocks weren't thrown though, but I could hear it walking the perimeter of my camp. The guides must have awoken at this point as the lead got on and said they can call the park service to come get everyone, but that would be hours, and it's better to stay put and make do. So I wait. It's close to 5 a.m. now. If I can make it a few hours until daylight, I'm fine. All the forest sounds have returned. I'm still waiting, and around 7:15 a.m., and I can see flashlights in the distance. Sun isn't quite up yet, but that eerie dawn light is filling the land. The clearing is still pretty dark. I start gathering my things and start putting the fire out with dirt around the pit, and by the time it's out, the rangers are there with me.
One of them was very obviously of Native American descent.
He said there are stories of men in these woods that don't take to people living on their land, that tribes have always sought harmony with each other. I tried to ask more, but he said we do not talk of these men. We walked back to Elkmont and met the rest of the group. One guy was clearly shaken up, and I assumed he was the one yelling on the phone. He only said its teeth were like an ape's, that he can't get those teeth out of his head. I still go to the GSM often as my parents live there. I still hike and camp, but I never go alone. Even as a former Marine and seeing some terrible things, I have never felt that primal fear as I did that night 17 years ago. That's my story of the time I did a survival camp, and only lasted 3 days.
I grew up in western New York, near the Pennsylvania border, and hunting is really big there. Seriously. The first day of hunting season, everyone skipped school just to go. Anyway, about 10 years ago, my best friend and I were smoking and riding around on her four-wheeler, and behind her property was a big open space. So we were just cruising along, and from out of the tree line, this big redneck, like 6'5" guy, no teeth, scraggly gray beard and hair, was covered in blood and holding a deer's head by the antler in one hand and a shotgun in the other. He stops us and tells us to turn the four-wheeler off so that we can hear what he says. And he says, "If you little ladies come on my property again and scare away my game, your butt will be next." And with that, we rode back as fast as we could to her house to tell her stepdad. And then he got on his four-wheeler and went back out to find him, because apparently that field was owned by her stepdad's uncle or something, but couldn't find anything. Not the scariest thing, but when you're high, that made us almost crap ourselves. Back when I had just got my license, we would go camp up in the George Washington National Forest, so we could drink a few beers underage and not get in trouble. It was me and my 2 brothers and another friend one night. We had a fire and played music loud and got drunk. They all wanted to go back down the road to this cabin because we saw on the drive-in that there was what looked like a party going on, and we knew the cabin owner, so they went off in the dark walking to the cabin, while I stayed back and tended to the fire. Anyway, a few hours later, like 2 a.m., they all stumble back, and our one buddy is complaining that these people stole his cell phone, and he wanted to go back and get it. But we told him we'll stop in the morning to look and go to bed. So the next morning we pack up and head out down the road to the cabin. And as I'm driving down the road, out of nowhere, this dude flies out of the woods and starts beating on the hood of my truck. He was completely covered in blood. We all get out, and we tell him to back up and try to figure out what's going on. This dude says the people in the cabin took his phone and beat the crap out of him. Not a good situation. So we go down to the cabin because I wanted to see if the owners were there, but they were not. The people staying there were what we described back in the days as devil worshippers. You know, back when the whole satanic panic was going on. Anyway, my buddy is frantically looking for his phone, and the bloody guy comes down to the cabin, and this huge goth grunge guy comes out of the cabin and just starts beating this guy with a log. I tell my buddy and my brothers that we have to leave now. Screw your phone, and we got the heck out of there. I think we called 911 once we got back into service to tell them what we saw, but we never knew what happened after we left.
Alright, I don't know if this is really what y'all are looking for, but here goes. And I should say I'm weirdly sensitive to like vibes or whatever. One time I was walking through like a gulch or whatever, and I got a super bad feeling. 2 days later they found a body there. I was working on farm through Texas, and then got a tip on one that was hiring outside of Mobile. So we packed up and head to Alabama. It was okay. The farm owner used to tell us Civil War ghost stories around the fire. Anyways, so we head over to Jackson, Mississippi. We stopped to get gas, and we're living in a camper on the back of my truck. And I asked the attendant, "Hey, do you know of anywhere to park where we can stay the night?" He looks at me, then my rig, and then my girlfriend pumping the gas. Then back to me and says, "Do you know where you are? You're in Jackson, Mississippi. Don't stay here. Leave." So I'm like, okay, that's weird. This guy is a freak, but whatever. So we start heading towards Memphis, and we Google mapped a campground just before the Tennessee line.
We ended up getting gas again, and this crew of real Hickory kids pull up in a crappy bubble window style Ford Taurus.
And like 4 quads. Everyone gassed up, and I go in to pay, and the cashier says that crew of kids is up to no good. So I'm like, dude, Mississippi in general is messed up, I guess. It's been a way longer than expected drive, and we get to this campground. There is only us and the campsite like maintenance guy or whatever staying there. And I just can't get the first guy's words out of my head and the image of that Hickory gang out of my head. But it's super late. I need to walk the dog. He's a big black German shepherd and he doesn't frig around, but he's silent. I didn't even know he knew how to bark until months after I adopted him. Things are feeling super weird. I'm getting a very strange feeling. I'm walking the dog around the campground and get onto this trail, and he stops. And I trust him. I always trust a dog before a person. It's just moonlight, but pretty dark. I know he's locked into something. I say to him, "You feel that too, eh?" And he loses his GD mind and just starts barking like he's yelling frig off to whatever it is. So I turn around, and he's just walking backwards, face still in the direction of whatever he was barking at, until get like a good 50 away, and he finally calms down. Wake up to a foggy, frosty morning still with grim feelings, but I'm determined to make the best of it and start fresh with a positive attitude. Stay in Memphis, feeling all right. Then go to the Jim Beam Distillery in Kentucky, and I don't know if you've been there before, but that place is grim. Just massive black barns that could hold bourbon, or witches, or stacks of dead. Just couldn't shake the super grim feeling until we got to Pittsburgh. The South is weird. I mean, nothing happened, but it still just got me so shook.
Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Get a good night's sleep, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye bye now.